I was 38 the summer my name thinned to a rumor in my own house. It happened on a Saturday gilded with easy weather, the kind of afternoon that pretends life is simple. I moved through the kitchen like a quiet current, laying out paper plates, sliding cut fruit into bowls, beading with sweat, smoothing a tablecloth that kept catching on a splinter. I kept meaning to sand. My husband's family drifted in their voices, buoyant and unbothered, and I did what I have always done when the air trembles with other people's needs. I kept the rhythm. I am a woman who teaches literature to restless teenagers, who believes a sentence can be a bridge. There was a time I built bridges at home too, between plans and patience, between hope and the empty rooms we kept lovingly prepared for names that never arrived. I used to be a person you could stand on. I didn't notice my own weight until the boards began to bow. Back then, I was still wrapping language around a wound I didn't know how to show. Aaron and I had tried for years timing tenderness with thermometers and clinic schedules, learning to hold our breaths through blood tests that came back with their quiet, devastating ordinariness. The nurses were kind in the way of people who have to be the kind that lands on your shoulder like gauze and sticks just enough to hurt when you pull away. I learned the geography of waiting rooms, the specific sorrow of posters that promise miracles. We spoke softly at home as if the walls could hear doubt and make it true. When the last round failed, Aaron started staying late at work. I started collecting silence, pressing it into the corners of our rooms the way my grandmother used to press flowers. If you do it right, it keeps the shape. If you do it long enough, it keeps you. His sister Mira arrived in February with the chaotic wind of someone who treats other people's lives like spare blankets. She brought 2 children with bright, unfocused laughter and a suitcase that looked heavier than her apologies. A few days, she said, and my palm opened automatically to the notion of mercy. A few days is a reasonable measure of kindness. But kindness can be a gate you forget to latch. Days lengthened, weeks slurred into each other, and soon her shoes were piled beside mine. Her shampoo lined up on the shower ledge like little soldiers, her laughter spilling late into nights. I needed to be still. She was the kind of woman who jokes the way other people draw knives, clean and quick, leaving a fine red line you don't notice until the air finds it. The children were not cruel. They were simply uncontained, their play expanding into every unattended space. I gathered their crayons from my bedspread and told myself, love is supposed to be elastic. I did not ask how far I had to stretch before I wouldn't recognize myself. When I tried to draw borders, Aaron asked me to be flexible as if I were a body to be bent, and not a person with a spine. Family, he said, a word that can be balm or blade depending on who holds it. Mira leaned into that word like it had granted her squatter's rights to my boundaries. She started hosting without asking, her voice ringing across our yard, her bracelets clattering like applause as she called my home a perfect backdrop. I learned to cook to the tempo of resentment and then to swallow around it. The night before everything cracked, I found her asleep diagonally across our bed, with the smaller child starfished beside her, and Aaron whispering that we shouldn't wake them, not after the day they've had. I took a blanket to the guest room and lay on my side, listening to the old radiator tick like a metronome. I counted the beats between what I wanted and what I was allowed to say. The barbecue that broke me into decision arrived with the kind sunlight that flatters everyone into thinking they're alive in the right life. Our yard held the golden patience of evening. I had twisted my hair up and rolled lemons under my palm until the skin surrendered its oil. People arrived with bowls and opinions. Aaron wore his easy grin, the one that used to be a map back to us. I kept the drinks full and the trash bag folded open like a mouth. Somewhere between the second platter of skewers and the neighbor's story about a promotion, I felt it, a subtle slippage, a sense that I had been demoted to scenery. The women talked over my answers, their questions more like punctuation to their own anecdotes. The men thanked Aaron for the food I had seasoned for the backyard I had strung with lights. Mira found a circle in the shade and filled it with herself. I stood nearby, not eavesdropping, so much as orbiting the gravity that always forms around her. She told a tidy anecdote about how spotless the house is now, that our girl is always tidying, and there was laughter, a warm, thoughtless laugh that held me outside of it. Then she put her hand on Aaron's arm and said the line that landed like a hinge snapping shut. If I went missing tomorrow, she teased. Nobody would notice for days. Dinner would still appear, the laundry would still be folded, the sun would still cross the sky, and maybe it would even be quieter. The laugh that followed had no malice in its throat. Perhaps that's why it cut so clean. A harmless joke, a small stone tossed into water to watch the ripples widen. Only I felt the water leave me. Only I noticed how quickly their eyes scanned past my face, how easily my shape let their gaze through. I did not ignite. I did what women taught to hold their breath do. I smiled in that faint automatic way we often use to deny the wound oxygen. I poured a stranger more lemonade, nodded when someone praised the marinade, and felt my body step a fraction of an inch to the left, out of the picture I had been forcing myself to fit. The sun slid lower, the flies found the watermelon, the speakers crackled a familiar song I could not hear. I went inside for a dish that did not need rinsing and pressed my palms to the cool porcelain of the sink. The tile pattern was a field of tiny squares, orderly places to set a life down. I watched a small ant find a path along the grout and thought about how long a creature can keep going the wrong way before it realizes the map is a lie. By the time the last plate was scraped and the last child was carried like a surrendered flag to a car seat, I had already decided. Decision arrived without trumpets, cool and precise, a blade laid on velvet. I didn't wake Aaron to ask him to choose me, didn't knock at Mira's room to barter for decency. I took the blue suitcase from the closet and filled it with the tender, ordinary things a life requires. I slipped my grandmother's locket into the zippered pocket. I set an envelope on the counter with copies of bills I had paid, emails, where temporary sprouted roots, snapshots of ultrasound rooms that held nothing but chairs and the sound a heart makes when it is tired of hoping. On a torn piece of paper, I wrote the smallest sentence I could live with and put my key on top. I stepped out into a night so soft it made me ache. I did not look back. The door clicked shut like a sentence finding its period, and somewhere in the quiet space between the click and my first step, I felt my name return to my mouth. The motel I chose smelled faintly of bleach and stale smoke, but the anonymity wrapped around me like a blanket. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, listening to the groan of pipes when someone down the hall flushed. My suitcase leaned in the corner, small and unassuming, but it held my survival. For the first time in years, I wasn't terrified of silence. The absence of voices, the mocking, the minimizing, the laughter felt like oxygen. The first morning I woke there, I sat cross-legged on the bed and wrote in my journal. The words poured out jagged like water bursting through a dam. I wrote about the ultrasound rooms, about the bruises from injections, about the night I pressed my ear against the closed bedroom door, while Mira and her children sprawled across the bed that should have been mine. I wrote about the barbecue, every sound, every smirk, every echo of Aaron's chuckle. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred. It felt like digging glass from a wound, painful but necessary. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild myself in pieces. I opened a bank account under a variation of my name, the letters shuffled enough that no one could trace it easily. I rented a small storage unit where I placed the relics of a life I no longer claimed, old photo albums, journals too painful to revisit, even the folder of baby names Aaron and I had once kept taped inside a drawer. Each time I locked the unit, I felt lighter. The past was contained. But at night, memories broke in anyway. I could still hear Mira's voice mocking me, see the way her bracelets flashed in the sunlight while everyone laughed. I could feel the splinter of Aaron's silence, sharp and unforgivable. Sometimes I dreamt that I had vanished during the barbecue itself, melted into air while everyone's eyes slid past me, not noticing the space I left behind. I'd wake with my heart pounding, but then I'd see the bland motel wallpaper and remember I had actually left. And no one had followed. By the second week, I found a listing for a cabin on the edge of a wooded town 2 hours away. The owner, an older man with weathered hands and quiet eyes, asked no questions. I paid 3 months' rent up front in cash. The cabin had peeling paint, a porch that leaned, and a kitchen barely big enough for one person, but it was mine. When I unlocked the door for the first time, the air inside was stale, but it smelled like possibility. Life in the cabin was stripped down. I ate simply eggs, toast, vegetables from the market. I woke to the sound of birds instead of arguments. I discovered the satisfying ache of chopping wood for the stove. I bought a notebook with a thick black cover and began writing daily. At first it was just survival notes, but soon I was writing essays about invisibility, about the difference between endurance and love, about how silence can wound more deeply than cruelty. I submitted a few pieces to small online magazines under a pseudonym. To my surprise, they were published. Women wrote back. They said they recognized themselves in my words. They said thank you for putting into sentences what they had been too afraid to voice. For the first time in years, I felt visible. Months passed. My hair grew longer, streaked with silver. I no longer bothered to dye. My hands grew calloused from work. I filled shelves with my own words, not the silence of someone else's dismissal. I thought less about Aaron. Or at least I told myself I did. Until one evening, I opened the old email account I hadn't checked since I left. The inbox was full. Dozens of messages, all from him. The early ones were furious. "You're selfish. You humiliated me. You abandoned your family." His anger poured through the screen, each word a spear. I hovered over the delete button, but some stubborn tether to the woman who had once loved him, made me click. The tone shifted as the months stretched. Fury gave way to pleading. He wrote that Mira had drained the bank accounts before leaving with her children. He admitted he was drowning in bills. He confessed that he finally understood why I had begged for boundaries, that he had been blind. He wrote that he missed me. One email in particular made me freeze. "I see you now. I see what I did to you. I don't want you back because of the house or the mess. I want you back because I finally understand you were the only steady thing in my life." I closed the laptop. My chest ached, not with longing, but with grief. Grief for the years I had waited for words that only came after my absence. Regret written too late is just another kind of cruelty. Love delayed is love denied. For weeks, his words haunted me. I walked through the woods carrying the weight of his sentences in my chest. But each time I imagined returning, I remembered the barbecue, the laughter, the way he didn't defend me. That memory was my anchor. It reminded me that invisibility is not erased by apologies, it is only healed by leaving. Then one afternoon there was a knock on my cabin door. I froze. No one ever came here. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pulled back the curtain. It was Aaron. He stood on the porch looking smaller than I remembered. Shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. For a long moment we stared at each other through the glass, the distance between us heavy with everything unspoken. I opened the door only halfway. "What do you want?" My voice was steady even though my knees felt weak. He didn't answer at first. Then his chest heaved and he began to cry. Not the quiet tears of regret, but the raw sobs of a man realizing too late that his indifference had cost him everything. I let him speak. He apologized. He confessed. He told me he had chosen the wrong loyalties, defended the wrong person. He said he finally saw me. When he finished, I said, "I'll come back only to end this the right way. We'll sign the papers. We'll be civil. But I will never be your wife again. Not after what you let her do. Not after you laughed too." He nodded. There was no argument left in him. He turned, shoulders bowed, and walked away. I closed the door. This time it wasn't escape. It was closure. The day we finalized it, the courthouse was hushed, like a library of endings. The clerk's pen scratched across papers that turned a decade of my life into official records, the kind that could be boxed and filed away. I sat across from Aaron, the man who had once been my closest witness, now a stranger in a wrinkled suit. His hair had thinned, his face looked gaunt, and his shoulders carried an invisible weight that I no longer wished to share. When the paper slid in front of me, I signed without hesitation. My hand didn't tremble. It felt like drawing a line through a ghost. Aaron lingered over his signature, his knuckles white around the pen. When he pushed the documents forward, his lips parted, searching for words. "I never thought we'd end like this," he whispered. I met his gaze and replied softly, "Neither did I. But you let me disappear long before I walked out that door." He flinched, but he didn't argue. For the first time, silence was not a prison between us. It was a mirror. He looked into it and saw what I had known all along. I left the courthouse and stepped into sunlight that felt sharper, almost new. The city hummed with its ordinary rhythm, traffic conversations, the flutter of pigeons, but for me, it was liberation. I wasn't tethered to waiting anymore. I wasn't enduring invisibility disguised as love. I was free. The weeks that followed were not triumphant, but they were mine. I returned to the cabin with a sense of finality and poured myself into writing. The words came fierce and unrelenting. I wrote about what it means to vanish in plain sight, about how betrayal sometimes hides in laughter, about how women carry grief like second skin. My essays spread farther than I ever imagined, shared across forums and social feeds. Strangers wrote to me, telling me I had given them language for their own erasures. Each message was a stitch pulling me back into wholeness. News of Mira filtered in through distant relatives. Her downfall was slow but inevitable. She drifted from one man to another, each relationship collapsing under the weight of her chaos. The children, innocent casualties, were shuffled between homes, their joy dimmed by instability. Mira's sharp laugh, once so triumphant in my kitchen, was now bitter and hollow, a mask cracking at the edges. I didn't need to gloat. Karma was already writing her story, and it was far crueler than anything I could have wished. As for Aaron, he sold the house under foreclosure threats. He moved into a small apartment, the kind with peeling paint and a rent he struggled to cover. A mutual acquaintance told me he drank more now that he looked tired all the time. His laughter, the very sound that had once wounded me most, was rare. Regret had carved him into someone unrecognizable. But here's the truth: I didn't need their ruin to feel vindicated. Revenge wasn't about watching them collapse. Revenge was the life I was building brick by brick, away from their shadows. It was the air I breathed without asking permission, the pages I filled without apology, the mornings I woke without dread. It was the knowledge that invisibility had not consumed me, that I had chosen myself before it was too late. One evening, I sat on the porch of the cabin as the sky bruised purple and gold. The forest hummed with cicadas, and the world smelled of pine and possibility. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who smiled through humiliation, who folded laundry with shaking hands, who whispered baby names into rooms that never held cribs. I mourned her, but I also honored her. She had carried the weight until she could carry it no longer. She had chosen to walk into the night with nothing but a suitcase and a fragile hope that she mattered. And because she did, I was here, whole, visible, alive. If you are hearing this, maybe you know the sting of being unseen. Maybe you've laughed along with a joke that pierced you because it was easier than exposing the wound. Maybe you've told yourself endurance is love, that silence is peace, that invisibility is safety. I hope my story reminds you it isn't. You deserve to be noticed while you are still here. You deserve to be chosen without begging. You deserve to exist fully without shrinking. Don't wait for someone else to see you. See yourself. Choose yourself. Because the cruelest betrayal isn't when others laugh at your absence, it's when you convince yourself you don't deserve presence. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your own truth because your voice matters here. And if you know someone who feels invisible, send them this story. You never know who is sitting in silence, waiting for a reason to finally walk out the door and into their own life.